My name is Anders Dahlbeck. I am the Global Tax Policy and Programs Manager at ActionAid Denmark. I will facilitate this discussion today. So thanks for everyone for attending, especially those in New York. I know it's very early for you, and I also know that we have at least some people registered from Asia, so it's very late over there. So thank you as well for joining this discussion. I want to thank especially our panelists who are with us today. We're going to hear first from Irene Ovonji Odida, who is a Ugandan lawyer and longstanding advocate for women's rights and tax justice. And Irene also served as one of the members of the FACTI panel. After Irene, we're going to hear a bit from Nalucha Nganga Ziba, who is the country director of ActionAid's Zambia. And Nalucha is a longstanding international development and human rights activist who has been very vocal about the need for tax justice both in Zambia, where she is, and globally. After that, we'll hear from Alex Cobham, who is the chief executive of the Tax Justice Network. Alex is an economist by trade and has been instrumental in tax justice advocacy for over a decade now. And finally, we will hear from Arvinn Gadgil, who is the Policy Director for International Development Policy in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, as you know, we're here today to talk about the FACTI panel report and how we can take some of the recommendations forward. For those of you who haven't had an opportunity to read the FACTI report, I recommend that you do so. It's a very brief executive summary that can be found very easily online, and it's highly interesting and relevant. But I think enough from me. We're going to hear from the speakers now, and then there will be a chance for all the participants to ask questions to the panelists, but also to express some of their own reactions maybe to the FACTI report and what they see as the key steps from now on. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Irene. Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anders. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And thanks for making time for this really important discussion. I think it's really important because of the issues that the FACTI report addressed. The FACTI high-level panel was initiated by the 74th President of the General Assembly of the UN and the 75th President of ECOSOC, who were respectively from Nigeria and from Norway, and was launched in February of last year in 2020. The broad mandate of this panel was to review the global financial system, identify gaps or impediments in its existing architecture, and propose solutions to achieve accountability, transparency, and integrity in the system. There were 17 of us who were appointed from all regions, not representing countries, but as independent members, bringing in our own views about the task at hand. We reported back as tasked within a year, and our final report was presented to the UN on February 25th of this year. In my view, the FACTI process was a significant and important process, both to the UN, but also to its members across regions. It was important because of the issues that we focused on. It was also important in this process to have close engagement of countries, close engagement of regions. And I believe that the success or any achievements that we were able to do as a panel were largely because of that close engagement by members of the UN, by countries and regions that were seeking progressive solutions, by the civil society, by experts on tax issues and the tax justice community. So political support was quite key in that whole process and remains important even now as the report is digested and as we seek the UN to adopt its recommendations. The background really to this, I would say, goes back right to the Addis Ababa agenda, which recognized that public finance is key to development. It also recognized that domestic public resources depend on ending illicit financial flows and made a link between the ability of governments to provide development, to drive development for citizens with the ability to mobilize public resources. both the Addis Ababa agenda and other processes, including the Mbeki process 2012 to 2015 set up by the AU, and other research within the tax justice community and elsewhere, UNCTAD and so on, have shown quite clearly that one major issue undermining ability of governments to mobilize public resources domestically is illicit financial flows. IFFs have emerged as a key issue on the global agenda, and were one of the main things on which the FACTI report focused in seeking to build financial integrity in the global financial system. And just as previous research, including by the Mbeki panel and others have found, we recognized that commercial drivers of IFFs were quite critical and account for a large amount of the losses to countries. And these losses occur not only in developing countries, but also affect developed countries. So this is a global issue affecting all countries in the world and all regions. In our report, as the FACTI panel, we recognize that financial globalization opened new ways for multinational corporations to cut taxes where they're due and to book profits in zero or low tax jurisdictions through base erosion and profit shifting practices, and also to exploit and drive tax competition between countries looking for foreign direct investment. We found that there's a huge cost to countries in lost taxes and other revenues. And this is reflected in a number of studies by different actors. For example, Zuckman recognizes that effective global corporate tax rates have declined between 1985 and 2020 from 49 to 23%. And data from 2017 shows that US multinational corporations reported offshore accumulated earnings of 4.2 trillion, 3 trillion of them in tax havens, and 2.8 trillion in just 9 havens, including 3 in Europe. So the scale and growth of offshore revenue losses show that existing international and legal frameworks are still not fit for purpose. Reforms have been attempted in various forums, including the Financial Action Task Force and the OECD with the BEPS process, but these have not kept up with the new globalized business models of multinational corporations and increased digitalization. And so we concluded that tax abuse, money laundering, corruption continue to plague global finance, causing rampant illicit financial flows. And so if we read the FACTI report, you'll see reference to trillions lost, in private wealth, for example, hidden in haven countries, 7 trillion, 10% of world GDP held offshore, and $500 to $600 billion per annum lost to profit shifting by multinational corporations, as well as money lost to money laundering and corruption, enabled by a host of professionals and institutions, including corporate lawyers, financial service professionals, accountants and banks, and so on. And you may have followed last year the FinCEN leaks, which articulated some of the issues plaguing banks. So what we also put forward, and this is something that we need to think about, is that the issues relating to illicit flows and lack of financial integrity are systemic. That we have a complex web of instruments, of rules, institutions, and actors that form the international financial system, and that dealing with the challenges around integrity in the system is quite complicated, but also needs a system-wide approach. So while it is complicated and highly technical, it is also highly political because of the vested interests involved, the political economy of this system. So at both a global and a local level, at national level, you have political economies that one has to address, that one has to deal with, individuals, institutions, actors who benefit from the status quo and are invested in sustaining it. Therefore, both technical solutions, but primarily political will and leadership will be needed to implement the various recommendations that we have made. And it is our hope that through the UN processes. I'll talk to some of those because of time, just very, very quickly. So we have our recommendations focus on three broad areas. Values that need to be incorporated into universal principles around accountability, legitimacy, transparency, and fairness, relating to tax, relating to anti-money laundering, and so on. We have recommendations around strengthening policy frameworks to promote financial integrity, to tackle enablers, to regulate them better, to protect civil society and the media, to support information sharing and end tax information asymmetries, for example, and to support capacity building. And finally, around institutions and either strengthening institutions or creating new institutions to support systemic solutions around data collection and publication, say on tax and rights, on asset recovery, around national governance and global governance, with a key role for the UN to coordinate issues around tax norm setting and a strong recommendation around corporate taxation and minimum taxation for corporations, as well as for a UN tax instrument. I urge all of you to read the report, particularly look at the executive summary, but even more importantly, to invest time in your various institutions to push and advocate for adoption of these recommendations by the UN and by your governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. That was a very, very interesting background to the report. I wanted to ask you just one question, which I guess is around what were your main challenges when writing the report? Were there any obstacles within the report drafting group, or any political pressure or anything else that sort of was challenging in the process of developing the report?
Yeah, absolutely. On the positive side, there was quite a lot of consensus within the report, and I think that's a credit to those who were involved in Norway and others who were involved in setting up the panel and in seeing the need for it. So I think there was quite a lot of consensus across the members of the panel from different regions about the need to have a progressive report that would address some of the systemic things that have been proposed and advocated for by countries, especially developing countries, but not only developing countries, and by civil society for some time now. So there was consensus internally, although we did not agree on every single thing, obviously, otherwise there would have been no need for a panel. It could have been drawn up by one person. But there were some variances, but for the large part, I would say there was consensus. However, the process was challenging, partly because of the time, partly because of the times themselves. We were operating during COVID, but there was also pressure in the course of the process. Right from the launch, there were countries, or groups of countries that did not see the need for change, and I would believe continue not to support many of these proposals. However, there is a lot of data and research behind this, not only by the panel, but also from decades of work by other institutions in the tax justice community, demonstrating the need for more fairness, for more transparency, for more inclusion of countries, particularly addressing the needs of developing countries that are affected by some of these gaps and loopholes within the international financial system, in tax, in trade, and so on. So there was pressure, and because of that, the role of countries, of groups within the UN, of regions that sought reform, that really supported progressive outcomes, was crucial. And so certain countries played a major role, certain regions did play a major role, and that sort of support continues to be important. Within Europe, you have some of the Nordic countries played quite a good role in this. We had regions like Africa, where the Africa group played a major role. And I think it is important moving forward to appreciate that there will be a lot of resistance. This kind of reforms have been attempted before. We have the experience from the 70s within the UN system, and pretty much the same actors today will be fighting against some of these changes, because a big part of this is around ensuring that there is regulation of large corporate actors within the global economy. It's about ensuring that governments and the international community rein in some of those practices that prevent fair benefits to countries where profits are made. And that means that there are vested interests affected by this. So organizing and mobilization by civil society, by citizens is critical. And that will start with reading the report, understanding what it proposes, and identifying opportunities in the UN processes that are upcoming and opportunities at regional level, whether in the African Union or in Europe or in Latin America and Asia, that these recommendations can be advanced, and working with countries and groups of countries to support more transparency in international finance and in the system that regulates these large actors.
Great, thank you very, very much, Irene. That was really interesting. I can see we start to have some questions in the chat function. We will save those until we've listened to all the panelists, and then we will direct them to the panel as a whole, I think. So moving on, we're going to hand over to Nalucha, who's the country director of ActionAid's Zambia. Nalucha, a few people have joined in the last 5-10 minutes, so feel free to just, as a way of introduction, just a sentence or two about who you are, and then we very much look forward to hearing your reflections on this topic.
Thank you very much, Andreas. My name is Nalucha Nganga Ziba. I'm the country director for ActionAid in Zambia and also a human rights advocate. Joining you today in Zambia, and just to indicate that I work for ActionAid, which is a global entity that works to eradicate poverty globally and focuses so much on issues to do with domestic resource financing as well as international financing as an effort to end and eradicate poverty globally. Therefore, the focus and angle I will take for this report is really to look at how financing for development is an important agenda when it comes to advancing the Sustainable Development Goal attainment in relation to services such as education, health, and others, which are very quite much needed in terms of the community that I work with, and this is usually the poor people, which is mainly made up of women, young people, and youth. So when we look at the issue of sustainable development goals, they envision a better world through which the promotion of long-term approach to addressing global socioeconomic challenges. However, it's clear that this is only possible with adequate sustainable financing. Therefore, there cannot be progress in terms of attainment of SDGs without meaningful resources. And how do countries raise resources? I know I'm speaking to tax experts. It's largely through domestic resource mobilization for countries such as the country I represent, and I come from Zambia. But when you look at how countries negotiate their trade agreements or taxation agreements, it gives much worries in terms of the technical capacities to be able to negotiate with most of the global North countries. For instance, in part of the work that we did as ActionAid Zambia some time back, we looked at the double taxation agreement that Zambia had signed with one of the countries, which was facilitating for the operations of a particular entity to operate in Zambia and run their businesses. And we found that they went on a shopping tax treaty and decided to use the Zambia Island tax treaty. And they went and incorporated a company in Ireland as an offshore to try and get better in terms of our taxation laws so that they're able to maximize on their profits. But that had an effect on the communities on the ground in which this particular company was operating, in the sense that they were not providing much in terms of services to do with health, education. And if you look at the amount of funds they were able to externalize in terms of profits, it would have managed to be able to build more than maybe 20 primary schools and put a good number of young children in school and be able to help the country attain its sustainable development goals towards education. So therefore, domestic public finance resources through taxes is not only the most important, but also most sustainable source of SDGs financing globally, especially in the delivery of sustainable education in many countries. This harnesses the risk of privatization of public service delivery and prohibits as well as raises concerns on equity of leaving many behind. This also reduces government and other reliance on external financing or resorting to overborrowing to finance sustainable development goals. And the example I'll give is currently, again, my country, Zambia. Currently, we are at a risk of a debt crisis as almost 50% of our annual budget goes towards debt servicing. So when you look at that, very little resources are remaining to go towards service provision when it comes to services such as health and education. Just yesterday, that's when our country was able to roll out a vaccine on COVID, and this has been largely enabled through the AU facility, which is largely financed through the northern countries to be able to manage to get a vaccine, which also is only targeting frontline staff and not the ordinary people in our country. But you contradict this with countries such as Denmark, which have managed to procure vaccines in excess of the populations that they have. So thereby we're creating a world of the haves and the have-not, largely due to the way we are raising resources and how we are financing the developmental agenda in most of our countries. Hence, enhancing the financing of SDG 4 and many other SDGs, such as have to do with health, gender, and also partnership for developments are getting affected as it entails enhancing domestic resource mobilization, which in most of the developing countries is being hampered due to the large debt portfolio and the large debt servicing that most of the governments are incurring. This has been, however, hampered by systematic challenges of domestic resource mobilization as well as illicit financial flows. So even from the various natural wealth and resources that countries such as Zambia have, again, they are not able to adequately realize domestic revenues from them, largely due to issues of illicit financial flows and tax evasion, and also the systematic issue of corruption, which has also, we have seen it playing out where you find issues of illicit financial flows. Therefore, agreeing with the first speaker, Irene, that there is really need for global reforms, which have to be aggressive in nature, and they will need a lot of political will to move, because at the end of the day, they're disturbing the current global architecture of domestic financing, which will not sit well with those that are benefiting from the current architecture of the global financing systems that the world is experiencing. In order for countries such as those in the global south to have any realistic means of financing their public services, we really need to push for these reforms. Therefore, there's been a web of existing international instruments and institutions in promotion of domestic resource mobilization, such as instruments and institutions responding to a wide variety of interests in the fields of tax cooperation, anti-money laundering, and anti-corruption. Yet they leave gaps around inclusion, implementation, and enforcement. The FACTI report therefore reviews the financial crimes like illicit financial flows are global systematic problems which require global system solutions like policy and legal reforms. When we look at the report, there's also the issue of effectiveness utilization of resources for the achievement of the sustainable development goals, as most countries, especially in Africa, are grappling with corruption, which does not only compromise the quality of SDG financing, but also the subsequent provision of public services. Even illicit financial flows and other financial crimes are perpetuated by corruption. Corruption is another systematic financial challenge, which needs a systematic solution, both at global and at national levels. For instance, we have financial institutions which are set up in countries such as in Zambia. We have the Financial Intelligence Center. And when you look at the reports that have been released in the trends report the last 2 to 3 years, all of them, you are seeing an increase in illicit financial flows. And there's very little much accompanied in terms of judicial reforms and other reforms that need to curb the losses that such countries are incurring. So when we speak to the recommendation of the report, we agree that countries should enact legislations that provide for the widest possible range of legal tools to pursue cross-border financial crimes, as most of these illicit financial crimes are committed in webs which are too complex for a single country to pursue. And also improve the tax transparency by having private multinational entities publish accounting and financial information on a country-by-country basis, as this will help in terms of naming and shaming, but also bringing about transparency and accountability when it comes to international financing. Also, establishment of a global center for monitoring tax and rights to collect and disseminate national aggregated and detailed data about taxation and tax cooperation on a global basis. And I think as an entity, as ActionAid, for a long time, we have been campaigning for a global entity that looks at issues of taxation. And even this report points to the need for that entity to be set up. And we think now is the right time to set up that entity, looking at the multiple crisis that the world is facing. On one hand, you have poverty, and on the other hand, what the COVID has also brought, which is pushing further into poverty, the people who are already living below the abject poverty line as measured by a number of global institutions such as the World Bank. The international community should also develop minimum standards of protection for human rights defenders, anti-corruption advocates, as well as investigative journalists and whistleblowers, as we have seen that states should consider incorporating these standards in a legally binding international instrument. We have seen that world over, it's becoming very dangerous for also civil society engaging in such works, as well as activists, as it is disturbing. And it's very disturbing as it goes up against various forms of power, more especially the corporate and the state power, which usually is found when you're dealing with issues of illicit financial flows. Then lastly, also taxpayers, especially multinational corporations, should pay their fair share of taxes, as the UN Tax Convention should provide for effective capital gains taxation. Taxation must be equitably applied on services delivered digitally. This requires taxing international cooperation based on the group global profits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nalucha. That was very, very interesting, and a lot of things that I would like to follow up and ask questions about, because there were very many interesting points brought up. I think for now, I'll just ask one simple follow-up question, which is, as you mentioned, there are many things that you're doing at a multilateral or global level. How responsive is the Zambian government to your demands that they take an active role in making sure that sort of the global architecture for developing tax policies and other accountability and transparency mechanisms are actually done? How active is the Zambian government, and how responsive are they to your demands?
Well, we've seen the Zambian government embracing some of the advocacy we are doing, as it is well researched and provides a lot of insights, more especially now that the country is grappling with the issue of debt and how they can maximize on revenue collection domestically and from any other sources. So what we have seen is that we've been collaborating very well with our Ministry of Finance, and this year, there was an announcement from the chief government spokesperson that government is considering revising the double taxation agreements that they have with a lot of developed countries in order to maximize on profits as well as taxes from some of the double taxation agreements that they have signed, and they're beginning to start revising some of those in terms of, and they've also gone ahead to cancel a double taxation agreement, for instance, that Zambia has with Mauritius. That was not beneficial to the country. So for us, we think we're on the right path, but also just to mention that a lot of our governments need a lot of capacity and support, more especially in the global south, for them to contribute effectively to the global financial architect. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very, very interesting. I'm going to hand over now to Alex. And again, since a few people were not here for the first 5 to 10 minutes, if you could just say a sentence or two about who you are and your background, and then please do proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anders. So I'm Alex Cobham from the Tax Justice Network. I think Irene and Nalucha really laid out the breadth of the work that the FACTI panel has covered. I want to focus, as you might imagine, on the tax aspects, which are throughout the report, and think about how we take this forward. So, as a starting point, this is something to say. The scale of tax injustice globally and the extent to which it drives inequalities both nationally and globally is enormous. And one of the things that's happened very positively over the last 10 years, in which the FACTI panel confirms, is a real convergence of high quality academic and other research into the scale of those tax losses that more or less we all suffer. And so the argument that used to be there about, is it really that big a deal, has gone. You know, we know this is a first order global economic problem, and it requires being taken seriously for global policy in that respect. But at the same time, the losses are not uniformly distributed. In fact, while most of the power to set international tax rules sits with the OECD, the group of rich countries, the losses as a share of current tax revenues are systematically higher for lower income countries, the countries that really don't have a voice in those processes. And of course, the OECD countries themselves are actually responsible for the great majority of those tax losses because of the ways that they procure profit shifting by multinationals and the way that they facilitate offshore tax evasion by individuals. So we need, as I think Irene said, to recognise that while there are many technical issues in this, and the FACTI panel report does a great job of getting through them, the ultimate answers are political. If we don't confront those political inequalities, we will not deliver the technical solutions to address all of the underlying national and international inequalities. The FACTI panel is hugely important. We've written about this as a possible moment of the tide turning globally. And I think you see in the Biden administration in the United States a willingness within major OECD countries also to recognize the scale of this problem and to think about the ambition that's needed to respond to it. The FACTI panel really provides the blueprint for the Biden administration and everyone else to take the global fight against illicit finance, including especially tax abuse, forward. And what we've called the 4 wins of FACTI are these. First of all, as I've said, this kind of affirmation of the positions that G77 countries and the African Union and Economic Commission for Africa, a high-level panel, has put on the table already, the kind of solutions that are needed in terms of international coordination and globally inclusive mechanisms. But in more detail, the FACTI panel also lays out the 3 key elements of a policy platform that are needed to deliver this. And I'll get into the detail of them, but broadly, this is what the tax justice network since our establishment in 2003 and the broader tax justice movement from well before that even has been putting on the table. Things that used to be called unrealistic and utopian and so on now form the global policy agenda, but we have to see them delivered in such a way that the benefits are shared by all, and especially the lower income countries that suffer the most intense losses. So to get a little bit into the detail though, Irene and Nalucha have covered pieces of this. A central element is this ABC of tax transparency, the automatic exchange of information about financial accounts, ending bank secrecy finally, transparency of beneficial ownership for companies, but also for trusts and foundations to make anonymous ownership more or less impossible, along with all of the tax abuse and corruption that goes with it. And country by country reporting publicly by multinationals to ensure that there's kind of a level playing field for domestic businesses that publish their accounts too, that we can see when economic activity is taking place in one country, but all the profits are being declared in another, to understand the scale of that profit shifting and ensure that we have accountability about who is benefiting and about making progress against it. These are transparency measures with real power. In terms of the corporate tax vision, it's kind of really great to see the FACTI panel lay out what the OECD has been edging towards, but can't quite bring itself to see the full ambition of. 2 key elements: recognizing that multinationals maximize profit at the global level, not in an individual subsidiary or other entity, and that they need to be taxed at that global level. And instead of playing with transfer pricing rules, we need to simply apportion that global profit between the countries where the real activity takes place. There's a little bit of this in Pillar 1 of the current OECD discussions, but it's only a tiny little piece. And then secondly, a global minimum corporate tax. Not just to require that profits be taxed where activity takes place, making profit shifting much harder, but also to make it unattractive by removing the incentive, by ensuring that wherever you get your profits to, they're going to face at least a serious minimum rate. And the Biden administration's proposal of 21% really raises the ambition from what the OECD was talking about in a way that's very beneficial. But unfortunately, the current OECD proposals, and we have a paper out on this today, would ensure that the great majority of the benefits of that would be captured by OECD countries, in fact, a disproportionate amount, despite the fact that these are the countries in total responsible for the great bulk of the problem. Lower income countries would largely be cut out, whereas we've put forward a simple proposal that would actually ensure a broad sharing of the benefits. OECD countries wouldn't gain any less, but lower income countries would gain much more simply by ensuring that the system is more effective. That kind of proposal ought to be coming out of the discussions, but because the OECD is a group of rich countries, it continues not to be there, and the voices that are missing are the interests that are absent from what's being discussed. And that's why we need this third element, the global architectural reforms that the FACTI panel has proposed to move the decision-making into globally inclusive settings where there is at least a chance for everyone to have a voice. And the key piece of that is a UN tax convention, both to negotiate and set international standards for transparency and cooperation, but also to provide the basis for the other elements, particularly an intergovernmental body under UN auspices to negotiate international tax rules within the setting of ECOSOC. And alongside that, as Nalucha mentioned, the Centre for Monitoring Taxing Rights. Again, that could perhaps feel like a sort of a small piece of transparency, but actually, you know, the State of Tax Justice report that we're now publishing every year shows the level of tax losses that each jurisdiction suffers and that it imposes also on others. And that allows us to have an accountability. Having that type of analysis within a UN setting, using the indicators that are now being developed for the illicit financial flows target of the Sustainable Development Goals under 16.4, would allow annual global accountability for each country, both for the tax losses they suffer, but also the tax losses that they impose on others. And that's the only way we're going to be able to drive this to a finish. So let me wrap up, but just saying this, the thing that we need, the one thing to make sure that this goes forward, and this has already been recommended within the UN Secretary General's process on illicit financial flows in the Financing for Development in the Pandemic initiative, is a UN tax convention. The only opponents of this now are a small set of jurisdictions which are largely the most committed to profit shifting and to other tax abuses. We cannot allow those jurisdictions, mainly OECD member countries, to stand in the way of global progress at the UN. In fact, their resistance should be a reason for us to recognise the critical need to move this forward at the UN. But that's where civil society needs to come in and start holding individual governments to account. We've seen the FACTI panel recommendations being discussed in various parliaments around the world, including in the UK yesterday, and the beginning of that process demands for accountability at the national level. We need that in order to get the global process moving forward. One last thing, I think Nigeria and Norway, who initiated the process to move the FACTI panel forward, should take a great deal of credit. And I think we know they've both come under a great deal of pressure about their role in this. We need other countries to step up, support them and work with them, as well as just applauding them for getting this moving. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was very interesting, and just like with the previous speakers, a lot to unpack and a lot that I would like to ask you about. But I would like you to ask you maybe to expand a little bit on the UN Tax Convention. You mentioned, of course, that there are some obvious opponents to this idea. I don't know if you're in a position to talk a bit more about specific countries that you think are most important to, where it's most important to shift their position, or where it's most important to hold them to account, not only by civil society, but I guess also governments to governments, sort of on a peer level, because we have some government representatives on this call as well. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a combination of some countries that have been willing in UN forum to take public positions very strongly opposing this. And that would include the likes of Liechtenstein, I believe Switzerland, and certainly my country, the United Kingdom. But I think there have also been other countries that have been quite happy to act privately without sort of putting their heads above the parapet in the same extent. I think it's important that we start at the national level, having in political processes, in parliamentary questions and debates and so on, forcing governments to be clear about their positions. Are you in favour of these recommendations? Are you in favour of a UN tax convention that would ensure the benefits of the ABC of transparency for all countries, not only the OECD countries that currently largely benefit from at least automatic exchange and country-by-country reporting? Are you willing to see, if you're an OECD country, the disproportionate power that you currently enjoy in the OECD negotiations somewhat diluted by moving that into a globally democratic process? And if you're not, then say so and own that, rather than doing it quietly behind the scenes. And as I say, it's really on civil society, I think, to start pushing this in individual countries to force those positions into the open. You know, we now have a process moving for country by country reporting to be made public in the European Union. And that's being discussed with the Parliament and the Council and the European Commission. We'll see if we get everything we want, but it's certainly a major piece of progress. But the reason we got there is because it was forced onto the agenda, and EU member states of the Compact Council and EU member states had to take public positions, and that in turn allowed civil societies and parliaments to query the positions that their governments were taking on their behalf. In particular, the Austrian parliament demanded that the government shift its position and put through legislation to force it to do that, because they were so unhappy with what had been revealed as the Austrian government's position. So I think we need to think about the equivalent of that, how we get national governments to take public positions and to stand by them and to allow pressure to change them if that's what's needed. That will be kind of the way this begins to move. And at the same time, continuing to work within the UN system, helping the UN Secretary General have the space and the courage perhaps to take forward these ambitions, which I think we feel are very, very much shared, but potentially blocked politically.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. And we do have a very related question in the chat box, but I think we'll save it for the discussion later, because I want to give Arvinn a chance now to come in and make his remarks. And as per the previous speakers, just please do a sentence or two about who you are, especially for those people who were not here at the beginning of the call. And then we very much look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Hannes. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I think you know, I'd rather that we'd met physically in New York for the FFD forum to discuss this, because I actually do think these are the kind of questions where we would benefit a lot by being able to simply sit down together and look each other in the eyes. But this is a good second best, and thank you for inviting me. So my name is Arvinn Gadgil. I am Policy Director for International Development Policy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. I have a history together with Irene in these issues. We were both of us members of the African Union high-level panel on illicit financial flows that was headed up by President Thabo Mbeki. And I've been working on these issues since I gained membership of that panel. But I just wanted to start by saying that this is a civil society organized event. It may be, you know, you see reality truly at close range, and listening to Nalucha is you know, she gives us a wake-up call, those of us who are bureaucrats sitting in plush offices, you know, what this really is about. And don't forget that this agenda wouldn't have moved at all if it hadn't been for civil society. And many of you have heard me say this before, but you will have, bureaucrats like myself or bureaucrats in multilateral organizations who think they own this agenda and always have been owning this agenda. But that's not actually the case. People like myself have been pushed into these issues by civil society. And anyone who fails to recognize that and makes civil society a false enemy, and I'll say a little bit more about false enemies, is going to step in going the wrong direction and make this journey even more difficult. So recognizing that while we have different roles, we have different interests to cover, and recognizing that necessarily has to mean that there will be friction is an integral part of this agenda. And in fact, when I look back at our original thinking about this panel, it was a necessity that there would be friction coming out of it. Because, if you launch a panel with such a great ambition about, basically putting forward reform suggestions that would, impact on the entire economic governance of the planet, doing that without any friction, you certainly would have failed, because no one in their right mind would claim that things are perfect as they are now. So, for me, I find friction to be success. It means political dynamic, it means movement, it means repositioning, but it also has to mean dialogue. It has to mean that we show the willingness to sit down and talk about these things, even though we may be very, may not be on the same page. And so this is one of my main messages as I, we'll close this in a few minutes, and I have a few suggestions on how we can go forward on that. But I should also say that when Irene is here, that I am incredibly impressed by the pace of work that this panel was able to have through a very difficult year for global collaboration. 17 independent experts who came together and produced this report with minimal amount of deference when it comes to the final recommendations. It's fascinating, and I find the report really great, wide, broad, and inspiring. But of course, in some senses, also imperfect. And I'm sure Irene will be able to, pay testament to that and tell us, in which ways we wish that the report would have been different. But given the circumstances, given the, conditions of work, the panel has done an extraordinary piece of work with, a consulting process, which would have been really something that other processes in the UN and elsewhere should learn from, with numerous regional consultations, background research papers, and being open throughout this process, which I think has been really impressive. Of course, I mean, for me, the importance of this report is, as I said, injecting new energy into these mega questions that we have to deal with as one humanity, and it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that there is this issue of dirty money or taxing rights or public finance is in the middle of a triangle of crises, which is made up of, as you know more than anyone, a crisis of inequality, a crisis of climate, and also a crisis of democracy. And in the center of this, you have an engine for that pulls these crises in the wrong direction, and that's the dirty money and unclear global economic governance rules. And I'm hoping that this report, besides actually putting together some concrete suggestions on where we should go as an international community, that it deepens the understanding that in the center of these three crises, we have this nexus or cluster of issues raised by the FACTI panel that impact on all of them. And if not handled, we will not solve any of the other crises. And that's just crystal clear to me. And I think anyone who reads the report actually read the report, not just assume what's in it, which I see a lot of people do, will see as well. It's a report so just to take us a few steps back, so where the background, and Arvinn said a little bit about this. It was a General Assembly that unanimously asked the President of the ECOSOC and the President of the General Assembly to do something or pay due attention to the issue of illicit financial flows. It so happens that Nigeria was President of General Assembly and Norway was President of ECOSOC at that time. So we sat down and discussed how can we do this, and came up with this model of an independent panel launching an independent report that could spur debate on these very challenging and important issues. Now, where do we take this forward? I think there's a lot of good things about having an independent report, an independent panel like this, but one of the bad things about it is that it doesn't have a natural place to land. It doesn't have a specific process where it enters. It doesn't necessarily, member states don't necessarily feel committed to this process at all. But on the other hand, that was not ever actually the intention of the two presidents. The intention of these two presidents was to make sure that the content of this report was something that was going to play an integral role in future discussions on all relevant arenas in the international community. And I think that still is the ambition, and I think that's still happening. Now let me end on this issue about next steps in collaboration and cooperation and false enemies. Now, there's a lot of energy in these conversations, and you will notice especially so less on the corruption side of the report and more on the tax side of the report, which is of course natural. I mean, there are big interests in play, and a lot of challenges in making. Not all of those interests can be satisfied at the end of the process as ambitious as this. But I urge you to think about how constructive friction is different from friction that creates deadlocks. And by that I mean, while I agree with most of the sentiment, for example, of Alex, I'm going to pick on you, Alex, because because I know you, about, for example, the role of the OECD, I think it would be wrong to say that the OECD has not played a role in furthering discussions on tax justice. While, of course, we can all agree that there are issues when it comes to legitimacy, and this is not a debatable issue; it's an actual issue. When you don't have every country participating on the same in the same way, there is a question of legitimacy when there's a system that would be structured for the entire world. And I'm sure people at the OECD will agree to this. But the way that I hear some voices talking about the progress in the OECD as entirely insignificant and maybe even destructive. That may be true, but I think, pick your words wisely so that we don't get into a situation of, which I find that all sides are leaning on arguments that are not necessarily well-rooted in empirical evidence, that are not necessarily designed for us to reach the long-term goal. Let's put it out. I was a bit cryptic there, I realized, but the idea is for me to underline the importance of speaking our minds as an international community, but also respecting roles, as well as, not least, respecting differing takeoff points and perspectives. Now, I think this is important because as we now, the next few months, as you know, discussions are happening at very intense discussions in Paris on different tax solutions, and we see movement, of course, with the new U.S. administration. I think that's really promising, and for Norway, that it will never be an option to ignore what's happening in the OECD, and and it will never be an option to do anything but support the process in the OECD until the point where it's proven that it's not going to work. And then we will always seek to build bridges. My government is pretty clear on this, to build bridges to find the most legitimate international way of cooperating internationally on these issues. So that is, it's possible to have two thoughts in our heads at the same time. And we intend to continue to do that, and also will, you know, implore others to avoid taking sides in a sense by default. I'm sorry, this may sound like accusation. I don't mean to. I'm just saying that I'm worried that we get into a debate climate. And this is certainly not only a civil society I'm talking to here, which disallow constructive discussion. And finally, just on Norway's position on these recommendations, we are at the moment considering the recommendations very carefully. And the government will have a proper session to discuss this. We're in an election year in Norway, so it's, things are a little bit slow, so it may take a little bit of time. But we hope, and if anyone wants to ask specific questions about Norway's position on issues, please get in touch whenever you want. I'll be available to clarify that. I have my colleagues. So yeah, I think I'll leave it with that, Anders, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. That was very, very interesting. I have a couple of questions. I guess the first one is on the very last thing that you said, and that is just to clarify, is the idea that potentially the Norwegian government would come out with a explicit public reply, or is it more, or did you mean more that you would have sort of positions on the different recommendations, or are you talking about sort of an official reply to the FACTI report? And I guess related to that, and I don't know if you're in a position to answer this, but have you heard of any other governments also actively considering right now their position on the FACTI report and potentially making statements about that public? And that links back a little bit to what was said before about, I think it was you, Alex, right, who said that we should push in various ways for governments to explicitly say that they support or why they don't.
So to the first question, so it's a bit, for a government we wouldn't normally, if there's a UN report, we wouldn't normally make a position on the report per se. We would make a position on the political, suggestions or policy ideas that are in a report. Not even that, often a report will simply just pass through and will note the most important issues, not necessarily formulate a position. So we won't formulate a position on the report per se, but we will. Our minister has said that we need to find on the most important recommendations of the report. Norway has to formulate specific positions. So it won't be, as you alluded to now, it won't be like a press release, recommendation 1 to 5, yes, 3 to 6, perhaps, I don't know. That's not how it's going to go. It's going to be much more, piece by piece, I think. And of course, this will show in the way that Norway will act in negotiations. And just finally, I think, thank you, Alex and others, for thanking Norway for this initiative. I think, which isn't really the case. I mean, it was the General Assembly's initiative. We simply followed up a task that was given to us. But your point, Alex, about getting more attention to the whole concept of framing of that's in the report, which I think is quite helpful. Among key delegations that negotiate outcomes of relevant UN processes, I think it's important. So to the extent that you can help letting people know about the report, I think it's a good thing. And again, I just have to underline that by me saying that doesn't necessarily mean that we support every recommendation in it. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much again, Arvinn. I wanted to pick up on a few of the themes that we've heard about in the presentations and ask the whole of the panel, so any 4 of you can feel free to chip in on this one. One of the themes which has also been asked about in the comment section is around some changes in the US position with the Biden administration coming out and talking about the global corporate minimum tax and other things. How significant do you think that is for really shifting the debates and creating the conditions, I guess, for quite a few of the FACTI recommendations to get legs and sort of actually be implemented? How important do you think that is? I don't know. I might go to you, Alex, first, just put someone on the spot.
Look, I think it is important if we look at pillar 2 of the OECD reforms, so the one about the global minimum corporate tax. So pillar 1 is kind of gone. It's been negotiated down to such a narrow piece, and the US proposal there.
Sorry, Alex, just because not everyone is a tax expert on the call, can you just very quickly say what pillar 1 and pillar 2 are? Just
Sorry,
sort of
yes. So pillar 1 is the piece that says sort of more focused on digitalization, and it says for some group of companies to be defined, and the US is now proposing really just the 100 biggest, we will ensure that some of the profit, not all of it, but some bit of their profit is aligned with the location of real economic activity, although they're only now talking about sales, not employment. So it's a small bit of profit and it's aligned with sales. So it's to help market economies deal with Google, for example, but it isn't solving the bigger problem that arm's length pricing doesn't work. So the kind of opportunity is on, and that's, I don't think there's any space to open that up in a useful way in the next couple of months before they've committed to deliver. The opportunity, though, and where the Biden administration have really raised the level of ambition, is on pillar 2, which is the global minimum tax rate. And there, the OECD Secretariat has been talking about 12.5%, the Irish rate, for a long time, which, offers very little additional revenue and risks actually starting a more dramatic race to the bottom if people are pulled down towards that. So for the Biden administration and Janet Yellen in particular to come in and say 21% is where we should be is kind of powerful. And so it's addressed one side of it, which is, are we talking about a high enough rate to be talking about a serious amount of revenue? And the answer is yes. We've put out a paper today which shows something in the order of $500 or $600 billion is at stake if we were to impose a minimum rate of 21% on multinationals across the board. But what the Biden administration haven't yet indicated is whether they support the current OECD proposals for how that would be distributed. If it was distributed on the current OECD proposals, about 3/4 of it goes to OECD countries, and what's left for lower income countries is relatively little, disproportionately little. That's even aside from the fact that those countries already lose disproportionately more. So it's a really unjust response to this problem, even with the ambition level. What we need is, this alternative approach that we've suggested that would apportion those undertaxed profits according to where the real activity is, sales and employment. Where are multinationals making their money? That's where we should be taxing it. And that would be dramatically different. That would see, the numbers I put up before, $427 billion of global tax losses. That's both from corporates and individuals. That's the equivalent of one nurse's annual salary being lost to tax havens every single second. If we were to do this 21% minimum rate in the right way, we'd be looking at something like a 30% increase equivalent in the public health budgets of lower income countries, exactly the kind of scale of intervention that we need to be thinking about in the context of the pandemic. We go the other way and it's much, much, much smaller. And with no benefit for OECD countries. This genuinely is a win-win if we do it well. If we don't, if we say, in a sense, the OECD countries are going to make sure they're all right and effectively deliberately cut everyone else out of it for no gain to the OECD countries themselves, I think that will be the final signal that the OECD is really not, in anyone's possible argument, a fit place to set these rules. And, Arvinn, I hear your point about not making this a fight of the UN against the OECD. And, the OECD has really carried forward a lot of stuff. They are the place that has landed a lot of the things that they told us that Tax Justice Network in 2003 were unrealistic and could never happen. They've now done it with a mandate from the G20. And yet they are considering now finally, at the moment where there is the global ambition to really do something at scale about the size of profit shifting, they are actively considering an approach that would cut out most lower income countries from the great majority of the benefits. That cannot be the way that we allow the global tax rules to be set. So I think we'll see, and we'll be working as hard as we can to support a good outcome at the OECD in the next couple of months. But it's almost inevitable that that needs to be followed by the beginning of negotiations on a UN tax convention, or we trap ourselves in these global inequalities for the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Alex. On that particular point, do we have any reactions from any of the other panelists?
Yes, Anders.
Please go ahead, Irene.
Yes, thank you. I think just building on the conversation, the role of the US and other now advanced countries is quite critical because, as I mentioned, and as many others have seen, the issues are very much political. So leadership is needed. It's important for us to recognize that attempts have been made in the past. And I referenced the 70s, where within the UN space, there were attempts to reform rules relating to taxing rights and so on, but these were scuttled. And that was really largely due to vested interests. I think the critical thing I would raise here on why it's important that the Biden administration has signaled a different view from the previous is that the challenges from the status quo affect everybody. Developing countries, low-income countries are affected and hurt much more because we depend much more on corporate income, but everybody loses. I think there was a study done by Eurodad or something like that, where they talked about losses within the European Union between, due to BEPS practices of corporations within the EU. So losses between different countries, members of the EU. These losses affect every single region. And it's incumbent on governments, on states, to recognize that their role is to be the regulator of everybody, is to be the mediator of different interests between corporate interests and the rest, because currently the primary winners of the status quo are the large multinational corporations, even at the expense of citizens of countries where they are headquartered and registered. So while the benefits at a country level, we see developing countries lose out, within countries, we also see inequalities, additional inequalities, with citizens of rich countries losing out as well to minorities. So it's important for governments to step forward and play a role as the arbiter, as the regulator, as those in charge of states, to ensure that those triple emergencies that Arvinn talked about, or those situations that Nalucha has elaborated very concretely, that those are addressed, and that where profits are made, the fair share of taxation is paid in those jurisdictions. So yes, I think it is important because of the power dynamics and the power differences between countries that we have administrations like the Biden administration stepping forward and being part of the solution. It's also important that institutions, so whether the EU Parliament, or the Pan-African Parliament, and other institutions in Latin America and Asia also do step forward and find and pull out from these recommendations the issues that are of benefit to the whole of the international community, and I believe that there are many. So the analysis that has been done by Tax Justice Network that Alex has referenced is really critical. It's really important for officials to get a better understanding of what is at stake, and for leadership to emerge, much more leadership to emerge from countries that have a lot more power. Last thing that I want to say is that issues like IFS really occur through tax, through trade, through investment, through debt, through international relations. In all of these different spaces, we see the push, and pressures that either supports the status quo or can support reform. All of these arenas are where these kind of things are played out. And so having now advanced country administration step forward is really critical, because all of these are at stake. And many times you have countries, smaller countries, less powerful countries, where you may have individuals who see the importance of these sort of thing, of changes, but because of pressure, either from because of the aid situation or because of debt that they may have, with regard to another country or group, they will be constrained to step forward. So it is really important.
Great, thank you very much, Irene. I'm going to hand over shortly to Arvinn just for a comment, but first I also wanted to say that obviously we have some other people on this call as well, including people working for other governments and IGOs, and if you want to step in, especially on this kind of when we discuss a little bit the sort of OECD versus UN and the general overall architecture of tax policy development, and do feel free to do so. Just put a quick comment in the comment section so I know to give you the word, but I don't want to put anyone on the spot, so if you don't want to, feel free not to, but just to say that we can, since we're approaching the last 15 minutes of the call, if you do want to weigh in on that discussion, then please feel free to do so. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Arvinn.
Yeah, thanks. Just to say that I think that the international community in general has quite a way to go on the Addis Ababa action agenda. And we of course welcome any government, including the US's ability to contribute to reaching the aims or the ambitions of that agenda. One of those, for those of you who remember this, one of those key points in the Addis agenda was the question about the status of the tax committee in the UN. And it was a hard-fought compromise what was in the Addis Ababa action agenda, which is I can't remember the exact wording now, but it's pretty explicit about since those who wanted to upgrade the committee to an intergovernmental body lost, so to say. The compromise was that the international community should step up and give the committee the means and powers that it needs to have to do its job. I have to say that's one of the things that I would be asking for from all countries, is to actually fulfill that commitment, support the tax committee in what it's doing, and make sure that it becomes the body that it was envisioned to be. And I think if we could get, for example, other OECD countries to contribute to that, I think that would be a great step forward. There are a few that are thinking about it, but we still feel a little bit alone in supporting that ambition, which we were all, investing so much in to get a compromise in the Addis Ababa action agenda. And then the final, pointing fingers thing. I find, and Irene and I have talked about this at length, also with President Dahlbeck, is that it is a bit frustrating that we have now several developing countries that have, more than enough power and influence to actually contribute financially and, politically to these conversations much more than they are today. To give an example, I'm being very open here. I mean, finding financing to do normative policy work on illicit financial flows is easier now than it was, but it's not long ago since that was almost impossible, even though it would be cheap to get stuff done. And I find it baffling that there are not more developing countries willing or see the opportunity in supporting financially these processes. India is supporting the UN Tax Committee. I think that's fantastic. It's symbolically important. It's actually practically important. But I think we need especially big developing countries to also step up to this. Again, I'm just this false enemies idea is becoming clear to me that we are building. I'm not saying, Alex, of course you have some good points, but I'm saying that we shouldn't. There is some introspection to be done by all parts, also at this stage, and one sort of introspection I think should be done with especially those big developing countries that will have a lot to gain from a different global tax regime. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Arvinn. I wanted then to come back to a slightly different point, which relates back to something that you said in your presentation, Arvinn, and I like the way you phrased it. It's that the FACTI report doesn't sort of land naturally anywhere, which I guess implies that it is what is made of it. And you also made it very clear that obviously countries look at the different recommendations in isolation and how they can be taken forward. But if we look more specifically then at something like a UN tax convention, to the extent that countries and other actors find that desirable to have, what are the sort of political steps that are needed now? Because we're talking a lot about political will, but I'm just thinking again about getting more practical, and some of you have mentioned it, of course, in your interventions. But I mean, what are the practical steps? And I'm thinking also, what is the message you want to send out to civil society people who are participating in this call, but also potentially some of the civil servants who are on this call listening, who might be, if not supportive, then at least interested. I mean, what are the concrete steps that need to be taken next? And again, I open up to all the panelists, anyone who wants to reply.
Well, maybe I could start, and then others can build on that. I think it's important to look at upcoming UN processes. Many of the solutions call for international cooperation and need action at the UN. So really, which is about UN members adopting some of the specific recommendations. For example, if we're talking about a UN tax convention, initiating processes within the UN spaces around negotiating that, or building up an intergovernmental body on tax, again, action that needs decisions that need to be taken at the UN level by member states. So I think one of the starting points is for governments and also for other actors supporting them is to analyze the opportunities in terms of specific processes, the spaces where issues covered in these recommendations are going to be discussed or can be introduced, and introduce them through your delegations in New York, and move so that these processes gain traction within the UN, including we just had the current the FFD process, but also including through the Ngangas coming up, and in September when you have the General Assembly, to see what can be done where. I think that is really critical. And for that, this is something that happened during the process as well. The role of civil society matters. During the process, for example, in addition to the consultations, the background papers, the support and input by groups like the Mbeki High Level Panel, whom we met with, and other groups that we consulted, we had at an individual level and at a panel level a lot of consultation with many of you, with the South Center, with the Tax Justice Network, with ICRIC, with different groups, getting Pan-African Lawyers Union, getting specific input, technical support especially, both for us, but also input that was given to delegations, because not all delegations have the, I don't want to use the word capacity, because that word often, the meaning of it, sometimes it's just not having the numbers, to pay attention to everything that comes both in the UN space. So giving support, preparing documents that can be referenced, preparing information about the research, the TJN you have, for example, around the impact of specific proposals, say within the OECD-based process, that sort of information, analyze information, all that is very helpful for delegations. So I think civil society, what I would really urge is much more engagement on the specific recommendations and support to delegations, which will have to make decisions, take up positions, but also make input into ongoing UN processes. And the media, I think the role of the media is really important in this. I talked, and some of you have also talked about some of the pressure in processes of this sort. those vested interests that will lose out and that will not necessarily see the common benefit, the common gain. It's important for the media to highlight these issues, to write about them. Respected newspapers and columnists to write about this and break it down for society, for parliaments to understand and appreciate. So what will emerge from this will depend very much on the action that is actually taken by different actors, including by civil society. And this is an opportunity. With processes of this sort, you often have opportunities that do not always present themselves. We have a situation where I think, against the background of COVID, with a report like this, with the key countries on board and administrations in countries, there are opportunities at this moment that need to be seized. If we do not seize them, then we lose the moment. And that may be another 10, 20, 30 years before we come around to moments like this again. So let's not lose the opportunity. Let's actually take action that is coordinated, that is concerted, that is consistent, and that supports a positive outcome.
Great, thank you, Irene. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that?
I'm sure Alex has been thinking this through quite carefully, but I just want to say that normally convention processes take a long time because I mean, at least the few that I've been involved in, none of them are taking less than 10 years. And that's partly because you need to mature an issue, you need to build a friend group around an issue. So regardless of this particular issue and its political tension that it entails, it takes time. So but I agree very much with what Arvinn is saying. If the international community can get closer to at least clarifying whether that's a path they will take to get an international convention on tax, then the sooner the better, because it's important to ride on this wave now. But don't underestimate the challenges of doing that. Just a very quick story. In 2012, Norway actually developed a draft convention on financial transparency in full, and we shared it with a number of countries in the UN New York context just to test it whether it would work. That was a grave mistake, because the moment you present anyone with a finished text, they will revert to defensive positions. It's not, so you have presenting a presumably finished product for the international community to simply approve is not the way to go, but a very energetic process of step-by-step building is the only way that you can actually reach a consensus. That's how we did with the mine ban convention, for example. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of very short questions before we round up. I mean, one of the questions is around OECD countries that tend to be quite progressive on tax in general, but that aren't particularly interested in moving international tax policy debates from the OECD to the UN, and what we can do to try to influence them and to get them engaged on these issues, apart from just a generic kind of the CSOs and civil society should push on these issues. Any particular thoughts on how we can get other OECD countries more active on that front? I mean, what would be those things that would sort of be game changers for them, I guess?
Yeah, I'm assuming this, I'm probably the one that should apply to this one as well. But so one of the experiences with the FACTI panel is really fascinating, is that when we, and this is, please don't take this in a bad way, anyone who's working in the UN New York context, but the moment the panel moved off site, the moment the panel moved to regional context or capitals, the debate and engagement was, the quality of the debate and engagement was a wholly different thing. So the moving it out of these tense multilateral conversations and into, because then you meet, Ministry of Finance people who are focused on the result and not necessarily process. So that's in itself, I think, an important bit. Bringing these debates to capitals, making people engage in it, and civil society is the best. You have the most instruments and tools to do that. Now, I think the fact of the matter is, and let's face this, is that while we are strong supporter of the UN in general, for the obvious reasons, what it's not, well, I should be a little bit careful about how I put this because it may be misunderstood, but it's not necessarily a place that has had enormous amount of success solving technically challenging issues through negotiation lately. So I think a hesitancy on behalf of OECD countries has to do with the fact that the OECD offers a very concrete, specific pathway with both the energy and the expertise to get agreements pushed through. While there is some uncertainty about whether that's the case in the UN context, I think. How that can change, I'm not sure, but I think simply making the case that there are good reasons why there are some kind of agreements, which if they are to entail, if it can only function with global cooperation or global engagement, then it is only in the UN that these things can happen. So yeah. I'm sure that's not the answer you're looking for, but yeah.
That was a diplomatic but clear point, I think, and I appreciate that. We are running very short on time, so I want to see if anyone has a quick fire 30-second response to a question, which is a little bit about how we're discussing this very much within the frame of multilateralism, but obviously some of the biggest enablers of IFFs, illicit financial flows, are the British Crown dependencies. And to what extent are they affected by any of these FACTI recommendations being implemented? And I guess maybe this is a question also for you, Alex, just even from a technical point of view in the UK. Is there a risk that we, what's the expression, win the battle, lose the war, whatever it is, that we sort of manage to get to a point of great multilateral solutions, but actually because of these crown dependencies, we will keep on seeing big IFFs? You got 30 seconds.
No, in 30 seconds, no, these are not jurisdictions that have the power to resist something that's going to move as a coalition of the willing. However, the UK has a huge responsibility for having pushed especially the overseas territories down the road towards tax havenry, and the UK has to step up to the plate and say, we kind of did this to support the City of London as empire was fading and so that we wouldn't have to pay you aid. Now it's our responsibility to help you find alternative economic development paths. That really is on the UK, and it's about time that conversation started to be had. But at the same time, who can block this? Who would try to block this? It isn't small island jurisdictions that often get the finger pointed at them. It's major OECD and EU countries who are the biggest beneficiaries, like the Netherlands, of profit shifting. These are the countries that we need to be looking at and having some quite hard conversations at the domestic level about whether the tax haven business model is one that they want to continue to pursue as the world is shifting around them. Just very quickly on the OECD point, I mean, Arvinn says the UN doesn't have a track record of getting to technical conclusions that solve things on tax. I think we might look at the entire period of the BEPS process since 2013 as evidence that the OECD doesn't either, right? We're still in this problem almost immediately. The first BEPS process finished, the digitalization one started because everyone recognized that the first BEPS process hadn't done what it was supposed to do. There was a single goal of aligning profits better with the location of real economic activity, and it was abundantly clear that roughly zero progress had been made on that. We're still in that position, but there is a real possibility now that things could be quite different if they adopt a good approach to something like the 21% target. And I would say, I don't think it's kind of either or. When we push for better outcomes in a UN setting, it's not to say nothing at the OECD matters. Part of what we're doing is giving support and creating possibilities for the very many people in the OECD Secretariat who absolutely share a desire for a global tax just outcome. When we hammer the inequities of an OECD proposal that's been hammered out in negotiations with member states who are not thinking about lower income countries, we're not hammering the Secretariat, we're giving the Secretariat the ammunition to go to member states and say, look, have you seen what these guys are saying? Look at the numbers, look what this does for lower income countries. People are going to say this is unconscionable, and maybe it is. Shall we put something different on the table? And I hope that is very much the process that's going to happen over the next 2 months, because it's a very tight window. And if the OECD really comes out with a proposal that deprives lower income countries of almost any benefit while putting hundreds of billions into their own coffers, it will be difficult to see how that institution can continue holding that position, and that will be on the member states, not on the Secretariat.
Thank you very much, Alex. I am afraid that we have run out of time, and I want to respect people's time and also the fact that people might have other meetings and events they want to go to. So I had hoped to give everyone a minute or two for some sort of closing statements, but I'm afraid we're going to have to do without that. Sorry. I want to thank, first of all, of course, our 4 speakers for the great input and for the presentations. It's been really interesting to listen to. I also want to thank the participants in the call for their active engagement, including in the chat. I hope I've been able to reflect most of your questions to the panelists. And I hope that this is, of course, a conversation that will continue and that we will continue to find ways to keep the recommendations of the FACTI report in the spotlight. Thank you again very much to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.